to talk about, himself, his role, how he uses technology to make himself better and his team better as well. Michael, maybe if we can get started here, we'd love to hear a little bit about you. If you could give us just a quick background on your career so that people have context for who you are.
Yeah, no, happy to give a quick bio. Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Lyon. I'm one of the go-to-market leaders here at OtterAI. I've been in technology for the last 20 years. I started out as a BDR, like all salespeople, have done pretty much every job in the sales repertoire. Been an account executive, enterprise account executive, been a director of sales for both North America and EMEA. And here I'm really doing something unique, which is sort of changing Otter's go-to-market motion from purely a product-led growth motion to a sales motion. We are, a pretty large company. We just passed 130 million of ARR, but we did that almost exclusively on, product-led growth. And so now we're shifting our focus to being more of a sales-led culture. And obviously that is going to be a change of expectations, a change of behaviors, and also really deep introspection into how we're running all of our sales cycles, which is what I'm going to be talking about today.
Thank you for that context, Mike. Obviously, impressive the product-led growth and makes sense at the next stage of the organization. You're adjusting to some more deliberate sales motions. So one of the things we wanted to before we start showing people what you actually do and how you do it. One of the things we wanted to talk a little bit about is your philosophy on how to use these tools on your team. I think there's in some organizations there's a little bit of controversy on how to use whether to use the tools. I'm not too surprised that it's embraced in a company like yours, but your personal philosophy and maybe how it fits in with the organization, if you could share that a little bit with us.
Yeah, absolutely. When I joined Otter, I was recently at Snowflake prior to joining Otter, and we were a really heavy user of Gong. And for many of you on this call that have probably used some sort of sales, conversational AI tools, the power of recorded conversations is really valuable. And so the philosophy really goes to, what is the ROI or the benefit of having your recorded conversations? And as salespeople, obviously, we want to get better, right? We're always trying to sharpen our instrument. We're always trying to look at ourselves in the mirror, look at the questions that we're asking. Are we doing a good enough job during discovery? And I think having used Gong previously, that sort of allowed that sort of thought balloon to expand in organizations of like, once we are okay with recording our account executives for the purposes of training, quality assurance, adherence to a script, now what can you do with that information? And I've been in sales long enough to have been sitting through like call coaching where you watch yourself on screen, maybe in a crowded room full of people, and sometimes it's awkward and sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it makes you better, right? And I think fast forward a couple of years into the AI world, and now all of a sudden you can do that at scale. I used to commute an hour a day from San Francisco to San Mateo to the Snowflake HQ, and I used to get the Gong mobile application, and I would play that through my Bluetooth speakers in my car, and I would listen to Gong calls at like 2x speed, so that by the time I got into the office, I was ready to fast fire out some coaching and enablement. Well, nowadays I have Otter listening in on my calls. Every single call is recorded both internally and externally here at Otter, and that really is a fundamental shift for companies, right? Whether or not you want to allow an AI note taker on the majority of your calls, I think is a philosophical choice. Are we okay with recording our conversations? And some companies are coming to the conclusion that no, they don't want to do that. Sometimes that information is private and sensitive. But once you get over that hurdle of talking about where the data resides, whether it's encrypted, once you're okay with recording at least customer-facing conversations, you can start to analyze those. And I'll talk about how we have our own proprietary LLM that does that, but we're also leveraging obviously the ChatGPTs and the Claudes of the world to take all of that spoken word, which is really just valuable context, and turn it into something that can either be internal or external facing, which will help us close deals.
It makes sense that it's a philosophical question, and I think like in the beginning of using social media, people are very uncomfortable with personal data, and now everybody just gives it up. Whether that was a good idea or not, I don't know. But I use note takers as well. And sometimes when I'm in an in-person meeting without a phone or without a computer, I find myself wishing that I had it because I know I'm going to need to reference it later because my brain just doesn't really remember. Even before note takers were a thing, I could take stuff in a notebook, but there's no way you're going to capture all the context. So I do think it's really useful, but it makes sense that not every organization is going to be into it until maybe they see the benefit of it. You told me something last week when we were chatting about how you get adoption on your team and buy-in on your team with I believe it's called your deal war room. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you use the tool with
Yeah.
your team members?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I wanted to focus on early on in my tenure here at Otter is when I first started, it was very clear that my team was doing feature function demos. They would hop on a call and they would, talk about all the things that Otter could do and then say, here's all our features and functions. Isn't this great? And then kind of awkward pause, don't you guys want to buy this? And I realized that, that was a training and enablement issue. And so what I've done in the last year is really shift the focus of our selling to be obviously more value based. And so my sort of hypothesis was that I could work with my reps to try to help them get better at discovery, but also help mid-stage deals. And so every week, I'll have one today. We have a big deal war room. And that big deal war room is essentially where I open up my dashboards and I say, hey, where are our deals at that might be mid-stage? And we do this as a group collaboratively. And we talk about where we might be stuck on deals. And as a sales manager, you would waste a tremendous amount of time asking the rep to say, hey, bring me up to speed, right? But what I can do is I can say, hey, Otter, bring me up to speed in, a couple seconds prior to either having the war room or live while the war room is happening. And then what we focus on is, why did these people come to Otter to begin with? And what is the problem that they're trying to solve? And then who are the champions and the stakeholders that need to sign off on whether or not a purchase can happen? And then what we'll typically do is we'll ideate together on how do we build assets that we can share, because no one likes to be sold to with a bunch of pushy account executives saying, hey, I'm just checking in. Where are we at on this project? Like, are we moving forward? Should I put another touch base on your calendar next week? If you've never been sold to, you don't know how incredibly annoying that can be. But if someone is leading with value and saying, hey, you came to me because you had a problem that you were trying to solve, is that still important in your organization? And if so, I built you an asset that you can use to sell up the ladder to your boss or your boss's boss that talks about the value of Otter. And it can serve as an executive summary or a briefing that helps you sort of push the narrative of like, this is the problem with the status quo. There's pain. And if we don't solve that pain, it's not going away. Do you want to prioritize this initiative, or is this thing actually dying on the
Mhm. That's great. That's a great use case. And, I think that there's kind of two things to call out here. One is you're no longer relying on people on your team to input data at the right time when you can actually act on something. The data is being already inputted automatically, and there's no need to do it
vine?
manually. And two, you can live on your pipeline calls, or for those of us that may be in a client services or customer success type of role, right? On your, let's say you're looking at your major clients with your team call, figure out the follow up immediately and create it immediately versus hoping that someone in your team is going to send the follow up or rep is going to send the follow up at the right time with the right messaging. You can review it, look at it together, and everybody on the team can benefit from that. I think that's really cool.
Yep. And I think that time to action is really important. I also think context is incredibly important. We often look at AI note takers as sort of a hack for being able to remember kind of that needle in a haystack. Somebody mentioned a metric or somebody said something a couple weeks ago. And like you mentioned, Sergey, it's incredibly difficult, especially if you're having 7 to 10 meetings a day, to remember what I did, before lunch, but let alone 2.5 weeks ago. But I think for me, the more valuable context is what is happening in aggregate, right? If you're running an enterprise sales cycle, you might be talking to somebody 10, 20, 30, 40 times. We'll have year-long sales cycles where there'll be a standing meeting, for a couple months at a time. So then the question isn't like, what did that person say in November of last year? It's how has this person's sentiment changed over time? Are we trending in the right direction? What holes are there in my deals? What aspects of MedPick maybe have we accomplished or not accomplished? And then how do we fill those holes? And so for me, I think the really incredible thing is AI is only as good as the context window that you give it. That's why you see this almost arms race of Anthropic and ChatGPT, specifically with MCP servers, saying, give us everything. Give us your Notion docs, give us your Google Docs, give us your emails. And I think voice is really just the next frontier of that. And so obviously I'm biased about Otter, but I think if anybody on this call has Gong or Zoom or Google Meets, and they have this sort of like wealth of data that's getting created, it's important for you to structure that data and then make that an asset that AI has access to, because then you can start to do some really interesting stuff in the aggregate.
Yeah, 100% agree. You mentioned MCP servers, you mentioned a couple other things. I think maybe this is a good time to start showing folks in the room your setup. How if you can talk a little bit as you share your screen, what we're looking at, how you created it, and then how you're using it to actually help you in your job and help your team in their jobs.
Yeah, no, great opportunity for me to kind of show my screen here. So let me just jump in. You guys see this? So
Yes.
before I show you the UI, I just kind of want to set the stage. And again, this was something I generated in Gemini, so helping me get my thoughts onto paper. I like to think about Otter as kind of this conversational knowledge engine. And so really what we are is sort of like an omni-channel data collection tool, right? Meetings are happening on Zoom, like we're talking right now. We have Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, and also in person, right? People will hop in a conference room or they'll meet you on the floor of a trade show. So it's important to make sure that wherever spoken word is happening, you have access to that. And then what I believe that Otter is doing is really adding structure to unstructured speech, and then adding metadata as well as sort of like insights into the conversations that are being had. And then on the right-hand side of this diagram, it's about making this data available. And so I'll talk about our UI, right? Obviously, Otter has about 35 million users. There's people that love our product, but also making this data programmatically available to other tools as well. As salespeople, I don't necessarily want people to live in Otter. I want people to live in Salesforce or HubSpot if you're in customer success, like you mentioned, Sergey. But then our API and the MCP server are making this data available wherever people live. And I actually think that's the more interesting and more important kind of facet here. So I'll show Otter, and then I'll actually jump out of Otter here in a second and kind of highlight where this data can live elsewhere. So this is the Otter UI. I've added our note taker into this call so you can jump into a call and see, we're transcribing live. This is not something that happens in post-processing. This is something that can happen in real time. And then as with any AI tool, I think one of the more interesting things about what we can do is our LLM actually uses each meeting as its own sort of RAG-powered model. And I can ask questions, here in the chat if we had an hour-long meeting and I missed the first part of it, or, maybe I wanted to kind of summarize what had been spoken here. I can ask questions in the chat. I can also have it do programmatic things like write a follow-up email. And what's really cool is that Otter, we talked about speed to lead. Before the meeting is even over, I can go ahead and ask it to do something like write me a follow-up email, and it'll go ahead and do that here in the window before the meeting is even over. So really cool things that you can do that demo really well, and I can pop this right out into my Gmail if I want to. But what I want to highlight is that once you have all of these meetings being recorded, you'll see here that this is all dummy data, by the way. We're a HIPAA compliant solution, so I can't actually show you any live production data. But I wanted to highlight sort of what's possible with our custom templates. And then we're going to zoom out and I'm going to show you what this looks like in another tool like Claude. So the key thing to understand with Otter is that the transcript is really just half the battle. Right? You have the transcript which is being generated, but really the summary is the more interesting aspect here. And within a summary, there's also these key insights. Now, what I really like about these insights, when I first started at Otter, it was told to me that no one on the sales team does any data entry into Salesforce at all. All of these key insights can be mapped into our Salesforce fields. And so you can actually create the mapping in the Salesforce UI. And essentially, we can create either overwrite behavior or write if empty behavior. So when I do a deal review with my team, I don't have to worry about Salesforce hygiene. All I care about is the actual content that is filling up those fields in Salesforce. So our Salesforce instance is really robust with content. We have tons of information, almost an overabundance of information, which kind of creates its own issues as well. Like we have so much data about our prospects that now the question becomes, how do you boil this down? And that's really where we're doing some things that are really interesting, like custom templates. So we have sitting on top of our meetings the ability to do things. This is a meeting intelligence report. And this is an example where this is just running programmatically. So after a meeting is done, there's an AI sort of prompt that sits on top of this, and it can do things like distill feature requests, integration opportunities, upsell and expansion signals. You can create pretty much anything that you put your mind to it, right? And if you've used Claude and Claude Cowork, this is something that I'll highlight here in just a bit, but this is a very similar way of doing this in Otter, just in-house. So I'll pause there and I can show a couple of other examples of this, but we've got multiple different types of templates, and you can easily change the type of template that you want to apply here, whether it's a sales intro, project management, executive summary. This is one of my favorites. For every meeting that gets run, I can get an executive summary, a return on investment analysis, and then a mutual action plan that gets generated after every single first call. So I'll pause here because I know that was a lot, just throw at you guys in a couple of seconds. But this is, for me, the more interesting facet of not just natural language processing and transcription. For me, it's about what do you do with those transcripts once they exist?
I have a quick question to jump in with, Mike. So in this case, for example, where you're applying an ROI, executive summary, an ROI calculation, what if in the conversation the rep is relatively new, they got overwhelmed, they didn't have time to have the ROI conversation, forgot, or maybe the client pushed back and didn't really have it? What would happen here? Would this be essentially bad data in this case, or is there some kind of prompt where the rep would be reminded to do it next time? How do you
That's
run
a
that?
great question. Yeah, so we've got a couple of different facets there. One is if the data doesn't exist for us to create the ROI calculation, this will say not enough data, right? And it says we can't make an ROI calculation because of that. And I think that's an important coaching opportunity, right? If you're not talking about metrics, the M and MEDPIC, then you're not doing a good enough job of setting yourself up for success. And obviously, there will be many different types of meetings where you might not just be involved in the M for MEDPIC, right? You'll have onboarding calls, you'll have technical evaluations where maybe that is not the topic of conversation. But for my first calls, I think that's an important thing to go into like a rep scorecard. And I'll actually talk about that when we get into Claude and we talk about Cowork, because that's exactly what I'm doing. Is we're actually grading our reps programmatically based on how well they're doing discovery to pull metrics out of calls. Because if they're not doing that, essentially our value framework starts to collapse. And so you'll rank a rep really low if they're not talking about metrics on a call.
Got it. Yeah, I think let's go ahead and see that next example of your Claude instance. That'll be interesting.
Absolutely. So wanted to talk through, again, I ran some of these last night. So the first thing to talk about with MCP servers, essentially you can pull calls directly in Claude. And then what I'll do is I'll actually say, can you run something like a MEDPIC analysis, right? And then, the power of Claude is this model is amazing. I think I've been constantly blown away by how well, Claude performs and the amazing aspects that it can do. But what you can run here really quickly with just a couple of prompts is to ask a question like, hey, how well did this call perform? And so you can say, based on MEDPIC, give me an analysis, right? And then my next prompt was, can you create an exec summary slide of the deal status as it exists now to present to an exec buyer? So here's the example of taking just like 2 or 3 prompts, and I can literally within, seconds, and sometimes Claude's a little bit slower, but this is an example of me creating an executive deal summary that has the MEDPIC gap analysis using the MCP server, taking the context clues from Otter, and then being able to create a customer-facing asset. Now, do I necessarily want to share this with my customer? No. If I have a strong enough champion and I say, hey, we're trying to build this business case together, absolutely. I would say, hey, here's where I think we're at on this deal. Do you agree? Is there anything that we can do to kind of shore this thing up? But essentially, this is just 2 or 3 prompts in Claude, but it's using all of the calls in Otter as the basis for the context for this window.
Got it. And I know, folks, if you're new to the concept of a MCP connection, it's essentially a way for agentic tools to connect to each other and to talk to each other, and have the data be more structured. You know, yeah, actually, if you can, yeah, there you go. So you can see the.
Yeah, so for the
Mhm.
visual folks among us, essentially, once you've added an MCP connector, all you need to do is to toggle it on here in your Claude connectors. And so now, whenever I ask a question in Claude, it will use Otter as one of the repositories that it's looking for. And I can go in here and ask a question. You know, here's for the Otter Illumina embedded analytics discovery, can you give me a rep scorecard and coaching opportunities? And it will literally go in and find these pieces of information. And then I can build a scorecard for a call based on those metrics that we were talking about earlier.
That's great. Yeah. So you have all these real sort of live data pipelines available for you to reference and work with and create context windows around. There was a question from Jeremy in terms of how you integrate Otter with other tech platforms like Salesforce. You showed earlier those fields that you were able to map directly or overwrite. Is that also through an MCP connection? Do you guys have a native integration?
No, that is a native connector. So we built our Salesforce connection probably, I want to say 2, maybe 3 years ago. But essentially, those fields are mapping directly into Salesforce, and it's not via MCP. I don't even know if the Salesforce MCP is live yet, but these fields are getting mapped directly into Salesforce.
Awesome. Great.
So our HubSpot connector and our Salesforce connector are native connections.
Now, going back to Claude for a second, something you showed us earlier in the week when we chatted was sort of some of these templates that are scheduled to run, I
Yeah.
think before your meetings, if you can show
Yeah,
that.
I can show you guys one example of a template. So keep in mind, I can't highlight my entire Claude instance because I don't want to show anything proprietary, but let me go ahead and share Claude here. So I have a scorecard that runs on my reps weekly. And so essentially every week I have Claude Cowork enabled where I can go ahead and actually have the data pulled from Otter. So I'm actually running this live. And every single week I can get a scorecard from my reps for how well they're doing discovery. I can also base this on a value selling framework. So this is my rep scorecard. So let me go ahead and see if I can make this a little bit bigger for you all. I don't know if you guys can see this.
Yep.
It's kind of compact. Essentially, what we've done here is our new CRO is kind of laser focused on the idea of a 4-box value framework. So the 4-box value framework is, you know, how well are we discovering pain? How well are we quantifying impact? And how well are we aligning our solution to that quantified pain and proving out ROI? And so based on an uploaded project that I put into Claude, our RevOps director actually is running this, across the team. So every single week, I can get a scorecard for how well my reps are performing, and it'll give me actual coaching opportunities live every single week for how well my reps are performing to this scorecard.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and it makes it easier to have immediate sort of deliverables that you're going to be discussing in the meeting.
Yeah.
Mike, how do you make sure that the scorecard, the email follow-ups or presentations you're generating after calls to send to your prospects or to your pipeline, how do you make sure all these assets are actually high quality without having to constantly give it feedback, or refine it yourself?
It's a good question. You know, obviously the rise of AI is the rise of AI slop, right? And I'll be honest that sometimes the first draft of these is not the perfect draft. I will say that AI is allowing us to revise things pretty quickly. I would say that most of the time, given the MCP connector, that we can get to something that's reasonably good and valuable within only a couple of prompts. But I think that the big deal review that I run weekly is an opportunity for people to showcase what is going well, right? And honestly, it's an opportunity for people to ideate, what they've done with AI against each other. So it's allowing people to say, hey, I built this asset. And once you've built an asset, you can create that as a flywheel, right? So once Claude creates something that's, unique and interesting and good, you can then say, let me go ahead and actually upload this asset and then use that as the basis for future assets. And I believe that will keep your token usage down as well. If you're giving an asset to Claude and saying, hey, use this as your framework, it's not having to design something bespoke for every single opportunity.
Now, as you were creating some of these systems, Mike, yourself, can you talk us a little bit through what your process was for learning and implementing? It sounds to me like at Otter, you guys are pretty forward thinking and you're likely giving a lot of latitude to do this type of experimentation. And at least it sounds to me like you're creating this type of culture amongst your own team. But what was your process? If you're getting stuck, for example, trying to create a system within a Claude Cowork or connect a tool or something like that, were you just kind of spending your own time doing this? Did you have some folks that you could refer to?
Yeah. I mean, what's crazy about the pace of how fast everything is moving, and you mentioned this kind of at the top of the call, I'm sure everybody is looking at LinkedIn and saying, oh man, I'm so far behind because all of these people are claiming to have it figured out and they've fired their entire SDR teams and they've automated outbound entirely. And maybe that's true in some cases. There's probably some people who've hired a $400,000 and $500,000, a year go-to-market engineer, and they've built this thing, and they have 20 AI agents working for them. I think for the rest of us, it's really a lot of trial and error. Luckily, the platform is so good that you can ask it questions of itself, right? So a lot of the questions that I'll ask of Claude are explain to me the Zoom Info MCP server, or explain to me what I can do with Common Room once that data lives in Claude. And luckily, the tool is self-referential. So you can say, like, here's what's available and here's what's not available. And it's not perfect by any means, right? We are trying incredibly hard to build this sort of like engine as we are driving down the highway at 65 miles an hour, right? It is very, very fast moving. Our MCP server came out at the end of last year. It's only 5-6 months old at this point. So, if anybody is saying I've been doing this for years, they're lying to you because this technology is absolutely brand new. And so then the question becomes, how do you iterate on it quickly? And obviously AI is helping us all learn faster and trying and failing faster, as a way of getting better. So that's been kind of our experience. Is it's been a lot of trial and error, but at the same time, what works we keep and what doesn't we jettison.
I'm curious, throughout this process, do you feel like you've had to or you have gotten a little bit more technical? I don't know if you use Claude Code at all, but have you ever had to open up the hood more than maybe you've been previously comfortable and is even reading documentation, for example?
No, I would say if anything, it's made me less technical. I come from the world of customer data platforms. And so part of what I had to learn was how APIs talk to each other. And, for the longest time, the joke in Silicon Valley is like, teaching your kids to learn to code is the secret to them making, $400,000 outside of high school. I think the reality is that the AI is quickly eating a lot of those technical skills. And the rises of Cursor and Lovable and Replit and all these tools, that graphic design world and that coding world, I think is getting smaller by the day. It really, I think, is going more towards prompt engineering. If anything, what's made me good at AI is not knowing how the technology works. It's being intellectually curious to kind of like test its boundaries and ask better questions and then prompt better as well. When you ask the question, like, and you show this in an internal setting, if you have a good idea for how to use the technology, I think that's the most valuable thing. Once you have that context, then the world is your oyster. Like, what do you do with it? That's the question. It's like, how do you create better assets? Think about what this data could do to benefit you. For me, it's more been about doubling down on the business skills than it has been on doubling down on the technical skills. Now, there's probably folks that are much more technical than I am that can do cooler things in code and co-work. But from a purely business perspective, I think it's almost going back to basics.
Yeah, I've been on as we're starting to bring in folks like yourself that are really using these tools at a high utility level, if you will. Some folks are leaning in and opening up terminals and getting a little bit more technical. Some feel like these systems can really work outside the box. But the one thing that's consistent throughout is what you mentioned earlier, which is this experimentation mindset and the willingness to put in the time to learn and not be overwhelmed by everything that you're kind of hearing online about everybody's already able to do this, because everyone that makes those claims, oftentimes they're false. But even if they're true, they probably spent hours making it work.
Yes.
And I'm curious, and folks, by the way, we're going to open it up to questions here. We'll let you unmute yourself if you'd like in a few minutes, but also feel free to drop any questions that you have into the chat. But I'm curious, have you seen that manifest within your own team? Do you see some folks are leaning into it and just creating their own systems that then they're sharing with the team? Like, what's the process to make sure that experimentation that may be happening across the board is getting captured?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the question should be, how collaborative are you as an organization? And I think one of the things that we find is that this early wave of AI is really differentiating the folks that are kind of like the early adopters that are using AI to almost put themselves ahead of their peers, right? We find the same thing is true of Otter, right? People will use Otter as an AI note taker, and it makes them a better seller on their team, makes them a better product manager, makes them a better whatever role they're in. And they almost don't want to share that with their peers because they're using it as a personal productivity hack. But I think that as leaders, we need to instill a culture of collaboration, because ultimately, if people are using a tool and they're using it for their own personal productivity so that they stick out on a dashboard, that's not good for the company. We want to make sure that if somebody's figured out something, that they can then share that with their peers. And then really it's about standardization, right? It's about, hey, if one person's using AI, but not everybody else, then you don't have consistency and you don't have, brand assets, you don't have governance. So it's really about making sure that you created an AI policy. You are very explicit about who can use it, what they can use it for, and really the benefit for the organization, right? It shouldn't be a personal benefit. If you're using AI as your own sort of tool because it makes you better than your coworkers, I think you want to have a rising tide lift all ships. And I think we're seeing now that it's starting to democratize across the company. There was definitely a pushback of everybody getting fed, you have to use AI, you have to push AI into your workflows. We're now seeing a little bit of a revolt to that. You're seeing people push back on enterprise-wide wall-to-wall AI deployments. But where we're starting to see things equalize is if AI is providing productivity and return on investment, people are okay using it as long as it makes their life easier and better, not the other way around. If putting AI into your Word document and putting AI into your Excel document and places that it doesn't belong is making your life harder, then you're going to see a pretty big revolt to it. But if something is low and table stakes, like meeting transcription, no one wants to go back to writing handwritten notes. Those days are gone.
Yeah, I think it makes so much sense. And what you said earlier, obviously, it depends on the company size, the politics, and the culture and the like. But with companies or teams or leaders that are frustrated about adoption or about actually getting people to apply in a way that creates efficiency, ROI, et cetera, initially, I think half the battle is actually, like you said, creating a playbook, directive, not necessarily directive. Everybody has to use AI, but this is how you can access your data. This is our governance structure, making people understand and feel like they're not going to get in trouble if they're going to do something to encourage that experimentation initially. But then going from experimentation to real use cases that then you can standardize across the company for things you already know work. And I think if somebody can feel like they are seen as kind of a power user and someone that is bringing value to the company, other people are going to see that and say, well, I want to be seen as someone that brings a lot of value as well. Just like maybe years ago when you were in a company and you were the Excel guru and everybody went to you to understand how to build macros and the like, because you were starting to automate that way. It's the same thing as just a different technology that's much more powerful and evolving much faster.
I think that's a perfect analogy. I was probably one of the worst Excel folks out there in the world. And when somebody did VLOOKUP or a pivot table, I thought it was next to magic. But those people had built this sort of skills moat around them, right? And I think what AI is doing is it's breaking down the skills moat for better or worse, right? If AI allows somebody to do VLOOKUP in a pivot table the same as somebody who's got 10, 20 years of experience, it now makes it so that an entry level person can provide better insights to the organization. But the downside of that is that you can't build that moat around yourself anymore. I also look at what was broken, right? We built this economy over decades, and meetings is one of those things where everybody's got tons of stuff on their calendar every day, for better or worse, like internal, external meetings. And I always look at what was broken about the world prior to AI. And meetings, I think, is one of those lowest hanging fruit where you'll be in 6, 7, 8 meetings in a day. Some of them are necessary, some of them aren't. You immediately lose that information as soon as you're out of the meeting. Maybe nothing bubbles up to your executive leadership team from those meetings. It's purely people talking about projects, and nothing is ever written down or getting into a system of record. For me, I think that is the kind of like table stakes for what AI transcription and sort of like thought conversational processing can do. Is now you make every single meeting a source of information, so that like as a seller, like if I want to know what's the product team up to, if there's an AI note taker in the product team meetings and that information is shared with us, I don't have to sit down with the product team to get a cross-functional collaboration. I can just ask Otter and say, hey, what is the status of this product feature? And then it'll tell me, and then I don't have to have yet another meeting on my calendar. So it's all about breaking down the silos that I think naturally exist within organizations. And meetings is becoming one of those silo creators where if you're not in the right meetings, you don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even having the cadence and sort of the cultural, um, communicating culturally that you should record internal meetings, right? Especially because a lot of folks are working remotely or across countries or whatever it is super valuable. But a lot of companies are still sort of waking up to that. And I think from everything you're saying, we talked about the need to learn and be patient with these tools and technologies. For example, I use Granola, and I was trying to implement the MCP connection with Cursor last week, and it literally took me hours because it wasn't working, and I was reading the documentation, and the Cursor was contradicting itself, and then I finally figured out that I had to copy and paste manually the Granola's MCP code, the settings in Cursor. And nobody, no, even the AI wasn't telling me the mistake I was making, but it just took kind of beating your head against the wall a little bit to try to figure it out, and that's okay as well. Folks, if you want to ask a question, please go ahead and use the React feature in the middle there, and you can raise your hand, and then we'll call on you, and we'll have you unmute yourself. I have one question, kind of taking a step back a little bit, Mike, to what you were talking about before, because we mentioned context windows today.
Mhm.
You showed us a lot of these various templates. And I think for a lot of folks, especially when you're seeing somebody kind of like I was on a call with a product manager and he opened up Cursor and they had these complicated folder structures with templates and they were sort of referencing specific folders to make sure you can keep the context window smaller to use less tokens and the like. When you're working within your instance of Cursor, or even it even could be with Otter, do you feel like you have to manage that context window a lot? Are you actually storing templates in particular areas, or or has that been less of a concern?
Yeah, it's less of a concern for us. I mean, when you think about the type of AI that we piggyback off of a lot of the context clues that are given to us from the meeting providers. So, for instance, I have an Otterbot in this meeting now, and it's pulling all the names of individuals, and it's showing who the attendees were. If people were speaking, it's pulling that information in, and then we're also doing some groupings on the back end. So, a lot of what we're building here at Otter is the idea of like, how do you group these meetings? How do you create user groups? How do you create company groups? And so obviously the focus here is sales. And as a seller, one of the ways that I categorize all my meetings is based on the prospect. So if I'm meeting with a Fortune 1000 company, I may want to put a channel together of all of the meetings with that particular company. And so in Otter, it's as simple as going in, searching for a company name, and we'll automatically categorize them under that company name. And so then you created a smaller context window. So, just throwing out a name, like if we were to meet with like CBS, and we were having a meeting with CBS weekly for the next year, I can search for, hey, what's going on with CBS? Where are we at with that? And I can use that sort of smaller context window with the company name to be able to pull that information. So Otter is pretty good at that. Now, are there companies that are also trying to create different hierarchies with their meeting information? Absolutely. We have a native integration with SharePoint. And obviously, one of our largest verticals is like financial services. And what they're doing there is they'll have different retention policies for where they have to keep that meeting information. So sometimes not even in Otter, but sometimes in the tools that we integrate with, we have to create a taxonomy of meeting information that has to go to teams, to individuals, to companies, and then those folders will get created in other places like SharePoint. And then you may have another LLM that sits on top of that. So I think as we are creating more and more content, I think, Vadim, it is really important to think about where that data now resides and how do you not create yet another problem, which is an overabundance of information that becomes harder to search through.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example of, right now as the technology is evolving, it's either up to a solution that integrates with another solution to manage that, or somebody that is creating some consistency. Even as simple as, let's say, in a company where you might use Google Drive, right? You will have a way of organizing that data. This is no different. But in the future, the technology will evolve where it'll take that sort of mental bandwidth away from the operators and it'll start to structure the data itself. It's just still kind of maturing to get to that point. So we may need to figure it out.
And I think a lot of the future is going to rely on the quality of search keeping up, right? We mentioned at the top of the call that what Otter does is really provide structured to unstructured content, which is speech and audio. And now that you've created this transcript, you've created a searchable record. So I think that search functionality is going to be much, much more important moving forward. I think most everybody probably saw that Google is making a massive change to their search capabilities, that AI is going to be front and center, that the old algorithm for Google search is dead. And the way that search is going to be, different in the future is that it's going to be powered by AI. And so now it's a question of how good are we at grouping and looking for keywords and terms within transcripts and across multiple repositories, Google Drive, Notion, all the places where documents and information are stored. And then how good are we at surfacing that information to the surface?
That's great. Thank you so much, Mike, for showing us under the hood not only your philosophy, your team philosophy, but how you actually apply these tools. And I think something a takeaway for me is you can be an individual contributor, you can be a VP, you can be a manager, and you should feel empowered to get under the sort of get under the hood a little bit, get your hands dirty, and start building stuff like these different solutions. And hopefully, you're part of a culture like Otter where you have that leeway, you have that access to data, you have that culture of sharing. But if not, if you can start proving those use cases and getting rid of manual work that takes hours, saving your company money, or figuring out a way to automate things to make your company money, you can start to make that case for leaders in the company to use these tools more to open up some of the maybe the gates that exist, the barriers that exist to access to data and access to these tools. So I really appreciate it, Mike, you showing us and talking us through it. Folks, Vadim dropped a feedback link, and it's very important if you could take 20 seconds to fill it out. We're going to be running events like this with folks like Mike across different roles about every 2 weeks or so live, and we'll be sharing recordings and notes with folks that join. But if you could fill out the form and let us know what you enjoyed about this session, maybe what you would like to see in the future would be super helpful. Next, we're going to have a marketing leader come in and he's going to show us a little bit more about how he uses Claude Code, and he's become a little bit more technical. We're going to have another person come in a couple of weeks who's going to show us how they automatically create ads, video ads that are really high quality, and actually get results in terms of driving leads. And so I think there's going to be, we're going to try to bring you different type of content. But again, really appreciate, Mike, you showing us both the business side of the technology on your team, but also the applicable technical integrations that you've done. I think it was really helpful to see your particular way of doing it. So thanks a lot, Mike. Really appreciate you coming here today.
Yeah, thank you guys.
All right. Thanks for everybody that joined us here today. Hope you enjoyed this session. Would love to hear your feedback. And otherwise, hopefully, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Typically, we'll do these Thursday Eastern time at noon, like we did today. So thanks a lot, folks. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye bye.